All right, guys, I just want to pick up where I left off yesterday, talking about the results of Kansas, Nebraska. Because of the introduction of this idea of popular sovereignty, letting the people in the states decide what they'd like to do with the extension of slavery into the territories, it began to really break things down politically. That salve that had been sort of hiding behind those political parties um, really in the past had allowed for compromise, and no longer is that going to be possible because again, that pulling of those that element of morality into making one's decisions over the extension of slavery into the territory effectively begins to sort of break apart the political system, destroying the Whigs. Dividing the Democrats into now Northern and Southern Democrats, and then really also creating two new political parties because the interest of the people were not getting served. So we see the creation of the Republican Party in 1854, and then the Know Nothings or the American Party in 1855. So once Douglas, pushes through Kansas, Nebraska, through Congress, really because of popular sovereignty, slavery really now could exist anywhere. So we talked about that yesterday. Just wanted to recap that. So now we've got Kansas and Nebraska. And again, under popular sovereignty, the people are supposed to decide. The hope was that things would just continue as they had been previously, which is that one state would become free and then the other one would become slave. But as we know, that just didn't work out the way that they thought it was going to. Particularly with Kansas. Nebraska, it worked out pretty well, but regardless, people rush out to Kansas to help establish this idea of popular sovereignty and or help determine popular sovereignty in that state or in that territory. So, as we know, the abolitionists in the North sort of organized and fund several thousand settlers to move out to Kansas. And the hope was that, you would have this influx of abolitionists and supporters to help make Kansas a free state. But really, you've got people from Missouri coming north, and those as the text calls them, those border ruffians. You begin to see conflict emerge, as we sort of talked about, and the shining example of that, as we talked about also yesterday, is Pottawatomie Creek. John Brown and his followers, murder a host of pro-slavery settlers, and we're starting to see that violence is really sort of that only solution that seems to be emerging. That peaceful compromise that we saw on the first slide, on the one side of the first slide yesterday, is beginning to really just dissolve. So really, one of the things that I want you to think about as you move through, especially these further slides, is why should we not be surprised? Sorry about the grammar on there. Why should we not be surprised that war is on the horizon? Well, I really want you to think about, with every step as we move through, why we shouldn't necessarily be surprised with this. Next, as we see, there is a great deal of conflict that's happening out west, and when we see Bleeding Kansas begin to emerge, we understand that with Bleeding Kansas, obviously, as the title says, there's a tremendous amount of violence that's taking place. So what we end up seeing is that a Southerner from Massachusetts, a senator from Massachusetts, not a Southerner, but a senator from Massachusetts emerges, and he gives a speech denouncing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he targets the speech to obviously Stephen Douglas, who is the creator of the speech, but another Southerner named Andrew P. Butler. Not another Southerner, because Stephen Douglas isn't a Southerner. He's from Illinois, obviously. And anywho, so Stephen Douglas is one of the focuses, and also Andrew P. Butler. Now, I'll be honest with you, Stephen Douglas has heard his barrage of trash talk and insults in the past. And again, I think with Douglas, he was just kind of like, as long as I'm still doing what I'm doing and getting what I want, I don't really care what Charles Sumner has to say. But unfortunately, the family of Andrew P. Butler did not feel the same way. So Preston Brooks, a man named Preston Brooks, who was a congressman from South Carolina, and also Andrew P. Butler's nephew, decides to confront Sumner while Sumner's sitting at his desk, writing in an empty Senate chamber. Now, the thing you have to understand is that, Charles Sumner, when he gives his speech, he says things that sort of cross the line of diplomacy and civility. The Senate has long had this tradition of chivalry and being appropriate and being gentlemen and things like that. When Sumner's giving speeches, talking and using terms like raping a virgin territory and whatnot, many thought that he crossed the line. And now Andrew P. Butler. Also, when Sumner makes the speech, he's very insulting about Butler. I guess he's got a pretty big drooling problem, and there's just which he can't necessarily control. And there are some personal elements that Sumner attacks, and so as a result of that, Preston Brooks comes along. He beats the tar out of Charles Sumner. I mean, he hits him so many times. He hits him like 18 times with his cane. At one point, the cane breaks in half and he picks up this gold handled cane and continues to beat Sumner over the head with it. Sumner is so embarrassed that, he doesn't return to Congress, I think, for another 2 or 3 years. And so, I mean, this is really humiliating. But the problem comes after, is that, you've got, students at the University of Virginia who do a fundraiser and raise money to, buy Preston Brooks a new cane, and Jefferson Davis, who will future be the president of the Confederacy, celebrating the acts that Charles Sumner or the acts against Charles Sumner. So, obviously, when we see this, if the violence in Kansas really hadn't been enough, I mean, you see how senators who are traditionally exceptionally civil and how they deal with each other and address each other are acting literally on the floor of Congress. What's next for the American people? Is violence really our only answer? Which, like I said, I want you to consider the question, the really poorly phrased question. I apologize. So things really only increasingly get worse because, again, Kansas, Nebraska sort of takes out that element that really popular sovereignty can exist anywhere. And it takes out that Missouri Compromise that had really kept this element of civility for such a long period of time. And really with Kansas, Nebraska, allowing that slavery really could exist anywhere. So the story of Dred Scott sort of plays into things and continues the saga with this idea of where can slavery truly exist. And so we know the story of Dred Scott. He was a slave. His owner, who was a doctor, took him to Illinois and then I believe also Wisconsin. With the leaving and moving to these states that were, I believe it was, these states were covered under the Northwest Ordinance. That with all of this that was happening, once Dred Scott was freed, because I take that back. It was once Emerson died, he actually Dred Scott attempted to sue for his freedom, but unfortunately he was refused. And so what he does is he gets a group of abolitionists to help file suit to attempt to get his freedom. And so basically what it said is that, what the case said is that Dred Scott had been in a free state for such an extended period of time, he should be granted his freedom. But the political question at hand was, one, could Dred Scott even bring suit? And then two, does he have the right to sort of sue for this freedom? So there were a lot of questions at hand here. But what comes out of it really goes far and beyond what the actual question was, is really the Supreme Court just could have stopped and said, well, Dred Scott is not a citizen, therefore he can't bring a suit. But Chief Justice Roger B. Taney took it a step further, and he said, okay, Dred Scott is Black. therefore he's not a citizen, therefore he doesn't have the right to sue. Then continues to say that the Missouri